Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog, and I'm going to do something I don't normally do, and that is engage in a little bit of movie criticism of a movie that I think is very well liked and appreciated in the United States, and most people agree is a good movie, but whose readings that I saw didn't seem to get all the complexity. And when I was watching this movie, Parasite in English, by Bong Joon-ho, I was thinking about how much of the social context was actually lost on the viewers. It actually reminded me, ironically, of when Gangnam Style became popular in the United States, and Psy is parodying aspirational middle class Korean culture, stuff like Dongjong girls, which were women who would eat bean paste soup to stay skinny and to be able to afford handbags when they went and danced in Gangnam, even though they couldn't afford it. One of the things about South Korean culture is that there both is a capitalist class system and the chaebol system, but there's also a way in which class is inscribed even in the language. Like the other Japan Korean languages, which to some great debate, probably because nationalists do not want to deal with it, frankly, social class is encoded into how you address people. And it was very frustrating watching the movie, and I'm not fluent in Korean or Japanese, but noticing that the translations of the dialogue into English could not get all the class markers that are even formally in the language translated at all. Yes, someone says someone have something like 11 different formal forms. Yeah, it does. So there are times in the film, for example, when people are speaking to each other as far as age rank address goes in Confucian age rank, where people are actually talking down to other people in ways that would not be acceptable. But I was thinking about the meaning of the movie. You know, who is the parasite? Is it the rich? Is it the Kim family? Is it the other family secretly living in the house? Not to betray the movie. And I'm going to talk about this more in detail for Movie Night Extravaganza on Tuesday. And the parasite, in my mind, and something that I thought was not fully discussed in the movie, is that it is not romantic about working class life. Now, Bong Joon-ho has spoken a lot about this, that he believes that people should be fighting for a better future and for changing the world, but that he doesn't think as an artist that's what he should be doing. That it invites a kind of romanticism that actually gets in the way of artistic statements as anything like social change, because art isn't good for that. It reminds me of what Marx used to say about reading The Social Realist versus reading Steinhall, that he preferred Steinhall because Steinhall, despite his reactionary politics, portrayed social life accurately, whereas a social realist with their aspirations of, you know, early petty bourgeois socialism or whatever, always romanticized the subject. See, the parasite is how aspiration and alienation eat away at you. Particularly when there's no community. And you will notice that at many junctures in the film, community is posited as a possibility. Kiwoo, for example, and I'm trying to remember how to pronounce the father's name in the film. Kim Ki-taek. Ki-taek both at points start to show empathy towards other workers that they are screwing over to get the job fraudulently. But because their situation is so desperate in the basement apartment, which is going to flood, and I could talk about that. I've experienced some of that myself in Korea, and I wasn't poor. That solidarity became harder and harder. There was no community to root that solidarity in. That everyone is out to get their own, and the only people who they feel have the luxury to be nice, to be kind, to build community is the clueless rich people obsessed with the way people smell. Now, I don't know if you've ever spent a lot of time in Asia, and I don't want people to think that I'm being essentialist here, but Seoul as a city smells bad. And if you're out in it on the street all the time, you will smell funky. All right. It's part of the, Seoul has a very good trash pickup system, but you leave your trash outside. There's also a pretty hefty drinking culture. That all, and it's a safe enough place because Korea is so stable that you can get it, that you can have a really, hefty drinking culture. No one's going to like take your stuff if you pass out on the street. Or it's very rare. I mean, Korea is the kind of country you can leave an iPod on the side of the road and come back and get it an hour later because people won't touch it, although people will embezzle from you, right? The irony of that culturally was something that never left us, and a lot of people who would lean into their racist inclinations, a lot of foreigners in Korea would become very strange about this. But it's something that you see about saving face, and there's many times in the movie where people break social boundaries that are lost on Americans, I think. Like, for example, when Jessica or even the fact that everyone who's rich is taking English names, which is an interesting thing we can talk about. But when Jessica implies that the son may be schizophrenic and the mom freaks out, that's a huge cultural taboo in Korea. Like, if you want to insult someone, you call them insane. We literally didn't use the word. When I lived in Korea, I had to really beg my students to teach me how to say it in Korean. Now, I think about this because I think about left politics as something similar. The way there's a hidden class aspiration in the way a lot of people on the left attack each other. It's a kind of worm in the apple, so to speak. When you look today, I saw on, I won't say who it was. Maybe they're a fan. I knew them on Facebook. I saw someone defending Nagel's stance on, or at least saying, let me say, they weren't actually defending. I'm going to say this as fairly as I can. Pointing out that the left reaction to Nagel's stance on immigration is hard to justify, given the border shutdown during COVID is one way. So, for example, the land border between Canada and Mexico has been shut down since March of 2020 and not reopened. It's been extended. It's not a total shutdown, but it's pretty close. And Americans can go back and forth willy-nilly, but other people can't. So you can't even say it's really about preventing the virus from coming through, because if that was the case, you wouldn't allow Americans to go back through if they were unvaccinated. And as far as I know, there's no vaccination requirement on the American side of that deal. The left, whatever the left is, a phrase that I see thrown around so much now, I'm beginning to think the left is just the people we either like or dislike given any moment and what inflection we put on that word, has not said a whole lot about this. Partly because the lockdown situation and COVID and respect for countries like, I don't know, Vietnam and New Zealand and in all those cases too, we've seen recently that the Delta variant has broken walls, not so much in New Zealand, but definitely in Vietnam. So why am I talking about this? Well, while this pointing out of hypocrisy is utterly true, in a way, it seems aspirational to me to point out that you have a better understanding of class than the person that you're pointing it out to, and that reactionary who got chased into the right, whatever their flaws were, they were partially right, because even though they misrepresented Marx's position in the paper, and even this, that, and the other, that wasn't what people were mad about. They were mad about their anarchistic blah 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 blah. Someone said that a lot of people who were into PMC criticism, I think this was Forrest Miller, actually, who I'm going to talk to on Tuesday, were like new atheists who were formerly religious. That the shock is what it is because people really want to prove that they aren't like the other people that they see, and there's a shock of recognition that they could have been. That there's these aspirational class politics that is vicious in academia. And it's absolutely true. Where one will talk about equality all the time and yet also be going out and going into the best neighborhoods to recruit to your program and recruiting more and more towards the rich, and also showing significant contempt for people who come from the class in which you are coming out of. Are afraid of going into. That it is easy to have compassion for people who are far away, but people who do the work, get in, and still show their class signifiers, that's not acceptable. Because it makes the game a little bit too transparent, right? But this is the aspirational tensions of class proximity. It's where the fight is bitterest. See, this is one of the things that a lot of the Marxist left has never really dealt with in an honest way, I think, is how much aspirational class stuff really does pit people against each other. And that solidarity is a lot harder and a lot more intentional than just realizing that we have some kind of common interest in this vague eschatological goal, which we cannot even say that we have ever brought about in a way that has led to the equality. After all, even the governments that people are calling communist have Gini coefficients as high as the United States, but people will make excuses for that forever. It's a bleak worldview that Bong Joon-ho actually proposes in Parasite, because it's deeper than the Snowpiercer. Snowpiercer offers, a way to blow the train up, even though you're stepping out into an apocalyptic snowscape. But in Parasite, all the social classes are shown as parasitic on the other, and in basic denial of this fact. But isn't that closer to your lived life, if you think about it? The symbiotic parasitic relationship at one moment becomes clear that it can't stay that way. Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff I could talk about Parasite artistically, and I'm going to do that on Forrest's show on Tuesday. Like how it's related to, Korean domestic films going back to the 60s, how there's a whole lot of very specific things going on as far as like where neighborhood stuff are in, and I found myself having weird flashbacks to like, oh, Hiwa Station, Solde, Yonsei. The irony, by the way, Yonsei, Yonsei's a state as one of the state-run colleges is more or less free, and the elite thing about school and then drunken students who once they get in won't fail out. I used to be a professor in Korea. I know what they're talking about. it's a very interesting problem. There's a whole lot of other things going on that even linguistically, like the use of aspirational English, not to communicate, but as a class sign, and why it's used as the university applicator. And by the way, if you want to invoke class anxiety in Korean, speak English to them, because it's not because they're totally afraid of contact of talking to you, but if their English is bad, they've shown themselves to have less than perfect social standing. It took me years to figure this out, that people who spoke English very well were afraid to talk to me. And I thought it was just Confucian shame. And while there is some of that to it, what was also going on was that if their English was imperfect, it betrayed class status, not to me, who was clueless, but to the people around me who were not. Your role as a neutral intermediary in a culture like that is very interesting, and something it took me a long time to become aware of. But seeing it reflected in this movie, which most of even Bong Joon-ho, and Bong Joon-ho has Marxist sympathies, it's not something I normally see in those films. I love Bong Joon-ho's movies. I've been a fan of his since Gwemu, The Host in English. The Host is a bad name for Gwemu. While Parasite is a translation for the Korean word, which I will butcher if I try to say. Jisangtung, which would translate into parasite. Gwemul does not translate into the host, it translates into monster. And the monster in Gwemul is partially from Korean governmental malfeasance and partially from American imperialism. Not so much in over South Korea, but its ambitions on using South Korea against the North and China. And the monster is the history exploding out into Korea itself, removed from any American context. A movie that, when was watched in America, people did not pick that up at all, except for a vague reference to the U.S. military in the beginning and to the unforeseen consequences. Is it like Shin Godzilla? I would say a little bit, except that it's a more humanistic film than Shin Godzilla. And I think Shin Godzilla is a pretty humanistic film, but it's also more about imperialism than just nuclear bombs in a war. So I love Park Jun-ho's movie. The most disappointing to me is a movie I like, Snowpiercer, but whose revolutionary politics and explicit pitch towards the English-speaking market meant that a lot of the context was removed. Where do you feel you fit in as a class structure in Korea? As a Wikugen, as specifically an English-speaking Wikugen, I was in an interesting position. There was a lot of xenophobia aimed at us, but there was also a whole lot of admiration. And that admiration and xenophobia would come out in weird ways. Like in 2013, one of the last years I was there was this conspiracy video that was released that was talking about foreign men from America and Europe coming to give Korean women AIDS. And it was on a mainstream news channel, which, if you know anything about Korea, Westerners actually have to get an AIDS test to come into the country for any significant amount of time. Although that is relaxed, ironically, for South Asia, where people bring in sex workers. In a very unfortunate turn. What's the point of telling you that story? Well, in one sense, there's a lot of tension and outright distrust. And if you are African American or Black, there's even more outright distrust. Some of this, I think, actually comes back to the Korean War, where there are reports of how black soldiers were used for some of the most horrific anti-communist stuff because they were assumed to be more brutal naturally. So racist assumptions begot other racist assumptions in response. But there is an aspirational element to my status in Korea because I had a fair amount of money, and while I was not rich by Korean standards by any stretch of the imagination, I was removed from a lot of the problems that Koreans have, which is the cost of housing. I spoke a language that was seen as prestigious, and while there is a complicated feeling about the United States and South Korea, and one cannot say that it is uncomplicated, I was not seen as a soldier, and so the local opinion of me was actually kind of high. So where did I fit in a class status? Well, I was also a gosunim, or a true sunsunim, a professor or a teacher. My actual title was lecturer. All right, so I wasn't tenure track, but I also was not an adjunct professor, and so I had social access that other people didn't have just by my title. And the way titles are used, including in the movie, are important. Like when the rich mother calls Kiwoo, Kevin in Parasite, Sunsunim, that's an application of respect. But you'll notice it's dropped pretty quickly. But so when people would ask my professions and I would say go sunim, I got treated differently immediately. The fact that I spoke Korean, even though when I say I spoke Korean really, really poorly. All right. When you go fluent, I understand Korean very, very well. I cannot on the fly make sentences in Korean that are coherent. So I would say our notions of fluency are different, but I can understand the language fairly well, and including pick up things like disrespect, difference in register, titles, patronymics, and other cultural relevant things. Korean is a high context dependent language, but it's unlike in English, where the context dependency is all in connotation and things that we don't formally put into the language, like whether or not we use German or Latinate grammar, which is a big class demarker, by the way. It is also a case that in Korean, my social status was in some ways high, but in some ways completely outside. So people would occasionally tell me things in English or even in Korean that they wouldn't tell other Koreans because I would not judge them. I was outside of the social hierarchy. You also hear about this in Japan. So this is this way in which capitalism and Confucianism actually creates a kind of uniquely rigid social hierarchy. This is why Marxists who don't study, the local cultures in which capitalism partially melted away, right? We always talk about all that was solid turns in the air. Yeah, it turns in the air, but it doesn't go away. Just like all Americans have, well, not all Americans, but most white Americans have Protestant Puritan assumptions somewhere deep in their soul, even if they're not even Christian and haven't been for generations. You'll find similar things with the way Confucian culture is a kind of underlying background noise in South Korea, but it's also something you can over conclude from. You can make racial essentialist assumptions or ethno-essentialist assumptions about it and not see how capitalism is really working there as well. But I think the universal thing about Parasite and why we responded to it, even if we couldn't articulate it, even if most of the left readings of it were kind of superficial and bad, because a lot of leftists come from a class where they want to romanticize the class immediately beneath them. You will notice that people who actually come out of those social classes tend to be people who climb out of the working class, what we call the working class, the blue collar class, like, because Marxist terms of class and liberal terms of class and our sociology of class is different, but tend to be kind of reactionary about getting out of that class because you have something like survivor bias. You don't see the luck you had, and even if you put in I was teaching students about this today, even if, or not today, a week ago. Even if 90% of your success is your own effort and you have to believe in that, the thing that actually puts you into the next social class is luck. Do you get a break? My break was going to Korea and being exposed to Ivy League people. Korea for me was my break. Despite, aspirational, education, despite scholarships, despite all that, despite having connections actually from my schooling, even though I didn't go to a good school, I'm always hanging out with leftists who went to Oxford and whatnot. And I'm always like, yeah, I went to Georgia College. And I say that under my breath even now, right? I went to a second tier state school and was a top tier person in it. But you know what got me out of that? Luck. And access to people with capital. So I always tell people, both personally and politically, you have to be able to understand and move around different groups of people, different classes, different sections of those classes, etc. You need to be able to move and see openly and not romanticize or hide. For decades, people I knew romanticized the rich. When I actually met the true rich, it was a remarkably unflattering experience. But the other point of Parasite is that often when class solidarity is foreclosed to you because there's no community for it to subsist on, and it does seem like a war of all against all for any kind of benefit. By the time you realize anything like class solidarity, the only options left to you are often revenge. And even then, a lot of the revenge is not aimed at the class doing the damage, but aimed at the people who are climbing above you. And a lot of leftist behavior, if we're completely honest, is more this than it's more this than even sectarianism. The sectarianism is often a cover for aspirational revenge. Parts of what Nietzsche says about Nietzsche, people always come out. It's funny, right? One of the things I learned about left culture is that class signification, such as pronouncing a name the correct European way because of exposure, was used to judge credibility. Well, that is still a class signifier. That says nothing about my understanding of the text. What it says is when I'm not actively thinking in German, that I'm not trying to pronounce it like German, right? Well, you're like, Varn, you're being defensive, and that's I'm like, yeah, but what do you think all this is? Read some Pierre Bourdieu for a change and learn what class signification and social capital is. The left is far more vicious about social capital, whatever the left is, than a lot of other things, because a lot of it is just about aspirational revenge. Not the politics, but the way people interact. Look around. See the way people act and look at it with that view in mind. But Bong Joon-ho's ultimate conclusion is bleaker than that. This Ki-woo, who's probably the most sympathetic character in the story, develop class solidarity or just a dream of becoming rich to reunite with his father. How many people's politics, left, right, and center, really amounts to that? A delusional dream in response to trauma. A word that we throw around so much in discourse now that people forget what it actually means. Solidarity is important, but you have to build it on something. It doesn't come from nothing. This is why I talk about pro-social behaviors, and ranting on the internet is not a particularly pro-social behavior, so I'm modeling it for you poorly, if I'm completely honest. But pro-social behaviors between people in your community is vital. And I know community's become a bad word amongst leftists because it's been corrupted by the NGO set, because it's been a vague signifier that we can use to avoid actual political work. But without it, you don't have anything. Because what is it really? It is relations. It is the relationships which we build our lives, our relations of production, our relations of culture, our feedback loops, the way we could sustain solidarity, and some communities do. It is easy to take a reactionary position in regards to this. Very easy, actually. Right? In some ways, this sounds fundamentally conservative. It doesn't have to be. But without it, you have romantic dreams. All right. Well, I've already done too much talking tonight, so I'm going to leave this one at a half an hour. Have a great evening.